loss is always, there is traumatic, and that's why I say aging is trauma in slow motion, because it's a series of loss of capabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's natural. This is not to be fought. It's not to be seen as unnatural in any way. I think our culture very often does make it like we're battling cancer, we're fighting against death, and I'm, what's the balance between that energy as well as like surrendering and just accepting what is most natural.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And this is a podcast. It also is live on Facebook. It's on YouTube. And the 3 or 4 or 5 places our podcast drops when it goes out that way, and all the other interweb magical things. And today I'm talking with Jerry White, and Jerry's done a lot of different things. Let's start with the big famous one, which is in 1997. He shared a Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to the international campaign to ban landmines, and we can talk about that. So let me just start, Jerry, by asking you, you were mentioning earlier that you were doing some caregiving for one of your parents, and you're in Washington, D.C. right now, but did you say you had gone down to Florida, something to do with
Right. Now there's, as you know, everyone has a pandemic backstory that makes, that they suffered through. So I wouldn't say mine is actually unusual, except the concern was that my 87-year-old mother was in residential care up in the Boston area where I'm from. And I had moved to St. Augustine, Florida, and we just wanted to get her out of like institutional facilities. We had friends who were dying from COVID, and there had been incidences. So I have 5 brothers and sisters, and we all just like held hands and made the move of my mother to Florida and had full-time care and sort of responsibilities for her. So that was quite, I just recently moved to Florida. I knew no one in Florida, my wife and I, and now we are even more isolated with really my mom with Alzheimer's, not remembering our names, us, a young caregiver who lived with my mother across the street, and a bald cat. So it was quite a story, but I dare say everyone has stories that brought them to the brink.
What's happening with your mom as we speak?
Well, after a year of that, we realized we were not equipped. I was no match for the pandemic. I was no match for the politics of Florida, and I was no match for Alzheimer's. So that combination made us think we need community and support for her. She needs more stimulation and care than we can give her. So after we held through the vaccination process last spring, we were able to move her to a more appropriate place with everyone vaccinated in Boulder, Colorado. So very beautiful, lovely home with about 10 memory care patients and more of my family nearby her currently. So now it's
who all is out there in terms of your family?
I have a couple brothers. I have probably 4 or 5 nieces and nephews, friends. So yeah, even though we're from the East Coast and grew up in Massachusetts, many of my older brothers and sisters migrated west for college and then for living.
Yeah, I live in Massachusetts, just north of Boston, up on the North Shore. So what part of the state were you from?
Probably the mirror part of the South Shore.
Okay.
The Irish Riviera, but it was Cohasset, Massachusetts, so the bubble, the beautiful bubble that I grew up in.
Yeah, so I'm up in the Newburyport area, I guess, equidistant from where you were, sort of south. My wife, Jeannie, and I moved here from Switzerland. We've been in the same house 42 years, and our COVID isolation was a good one that I kind of miss now, because 3 of my grandchildren who live across the street that Jeannie and I have done childcare for the last 13 years, though they're all in school now, the youngest being 7, isolated and kind of sheltered with us, came across the street every day. And we had a wonderful time. When kids get a little older, as you know, school kind of kidnaps them and the whole routine changes, and suddenly they were all back, and it was great. So while we lost some friends in COVID and we've had our ups and downs with it, the sheltering experience was kind of lovely in an odd way that also made me think a lot about what other people were learning from the experience, in terms of my daughter, for instance, who's a CEO of a company in New York, was saying that as a woman in business, for the first time, the men she was talking to on Zoom weren't pretending they didn't have families and that it was all business. And the women she was working with were kind of admitting that they had other interests besides making it in the corporate world. So, there was a lot of shifting going on. Did you see any of that in terms of the kind of issues you're interested in?
I think it's all, you see the vitality and need for community, that you can't do it alone.
Right.
You aren't meant to do it alone. I think you see the sharing of responsibility over generations, as well as animals, and just caring, like practicing care day to day. And then I don't know, it's too like glib to say, but like small's the new big. Like if you just had like a good conversation and iced tea with your mom and she was able to swim that day, that's amazing. So just making sure that those little things don't go missed. And I think for a lot of my life, I've lived a big life, I would call it, and an international life. And so I do think it was a good period of time, 3 years in Florida, but particularly the last year during the pandemic with my mother, to just be like, to go small and take everything one day at a time, one step at a time, and actually and have very little expectations of what that day will look like.
Yeah, no, and interesting that you put it that way, because that was my experience as well. And then suddenly, the small things take their right proportion in your life, and you realize that actually a lot of these things that we sort of think of as secondary to, say, career, or the sort of things that get, put on a Facebook page or whatever it may be, are really the things that make us most happy. I have a question.
Like, not to interrupt, but it sounds like my mother used to say that like the two greatest gifts of her life were her adult relationships with her adult children. It's not the raising of them, but it's like the fruit of that labor, and her grandchildren. And that combination, she goes, those are high points absolutely for her life after raising 6 kids.
Yeah, your mom and me too. And it's interesting because I'm pushing 70. My wife turned 70 and she had a heart attack 3 weeks ago. She's fine. She had a stent put in, but it was kind of part of the whole package of COVID. Okay, now we're going to have a heart attack and sit in the cardiac unit at Beverly Hospital for a while, and it all turned out fine. But the interesting thing for me is when I was a bit younger, I would have always thought that when there was a lot less time ahead than behind you, that would be a worry. Actually, I find it sort of, weirdly speaking of your mom, to be a relief, in that when you think about the worries you have in life, most of them are future oriented. You're thinking, well, can we afford college for the kids? How's this book going to turn out? I'm a jerk sometimes to my wife. Is she just going to up and leave me one of these days, or can I change for her? But it's future oriented. It's nice to have a relationship with older children and grandchildren, because, okay, we did that and that can't be taken away. And there aren't so many worries in the future because there's less of a future. I don't know if that sounds nuts to you.
I wonder, I was thinking about, over the years, I've worked in different areas of trauma and resilience. And then, I'm 58 and no one quite guides one through the seasons. And then I was thinking, when I thought about trauma as like a before and after moment, I started to think that actually aging, which can be challenging, of course, is trauma in slow motion. So you don't really detect what you're going through as you actually increasingly, particularly if you're death phobic. So, but as you get closer to that cliff and you have people who are dying left and right, that's a type of trauma that is, in the atmosphere and in the generations. Trauma, I don't define as necessarily an awful thing. It's more just you are changed because of it, and you are built or broken down because of it.
Yeah, no, I must say the first shock to me was to have people my age or younger who were beginning to die. A wonderful children's book illustrator, Holly Mead, who won all sorts of awards and was just a wonderful person and a great friend of our family's, died sort of more your age that you are now of cancer. And it was way too soon and in mid-career. And it was kind of, okay, that was the first time I thought to myself, all right, this part's not going to be good. And it hasn't. I mean, we're not that old yet as the table of, longevity goes these days, but still, by the time you're 70, you've known people who you're close to who have passed on. And then, of course, my older sisters, my mom and dad are both gone. that's hard. That you're right to call that trauma. But I must say the prospect for myself of getting older does not seem traumatic at this point, other than wanting to stick around long enough to help my grandchildren in the same way that I find with my adult children. They're grown up now, but they're still my kids. I still am invested in their future, and you want to be around for them.
You so don't answer quickly, but ask yourself, because I sometimes get glib in when I try to answer. Are you afraid of death or death phobic in any way?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't think I am. And on the other hand, if you're in a situation where there's an oncoming truck, your heart beats fast and you steer clear. So, I get my prostate examined because my PSA numbers are a little high. I go to the dermatologist, and if she says there's a little problem here, I treat it so that it's not going to kill me. So you try to stay alive. I do a lot of building projects around my property, and I clamp the ladder to the edge of the roof. I'm careful. But when it comes to the sort of philosophical / spiritual, psychological consideration of death, no, I am not death phobic. But it has nothing to do with religion or hope of an afterlife or anything like that. It just, I've had enough things in my own life that I kind of regretted and wanted to change. Coming out of a right-wing evangelical background and really regretting my involvement in that movement in the 70s and 80s, that there's enough in the past that was worrisome where, death itself doesn't seem so. How about you?
I think it's probably more a hybrid, so I grew up with, Irish Catholic upbringing. And so, and you're reading Dante. And then I also left the Catholic Church for a while and also experimented with, home church and other such things. It would be more conservative Christianity. So do I regret anything about that? So the early years, through age 20, let's say, were formative and religiously minded. And I always had faith. So I think what changes over time is what are you afraid of? So, I'm not afraid of going to hell. I'm not afraid of the composition of my soul. I'm not afraid of, sort of international religious and other ways of looking at death, either from an atheist point of view or from a change in frequency and energy, or a composting point of view. So it doesn't feel that it's something that scares me, but I don't have easy solutions. I think it's a mystery. I believe from Stephen Jenkinson in Canada has written a lot about wise death. What does that really look like? And what's your role as a conscious elder in that period of time, even for younger folk as we move and grow older. So I feel like it's a very rich season to go to. And even as I see my mom, who's losing her words and ability to understand what's happening all around her, someone said, it's still a useful vocabulary for me, talk to her soul. She has one leg here and one leg moving to the other side. And the energy is not in her frontal lobe. It's actually the energy that's half out of her body. Call it a soul, call it a frequency. So continue to speak to that energy as opposed to keep reminding her of what she's forgetting or correcting her, which seems ludicrous.
Yeah, the advantage of the confrontation of mortality, there are moments when you're losing someone like we lost Holly, where you draw much closer because things are very serious at that moment. So things are said that are meant, that are good. With Jeannie, when she was coming out of anesthesia for her stent a few weeks ago, the procedure took about 2 hours and her heart didn't suffer big damage, and it was all wonderful in terms of the result. But of course, the worry when someone has a heart attack is you're going to lose them. And in that context, when she was coming out of anesthesia, I said to her, were you scared? We were walking along and I was holding her hand. She was on the gurney. They were pushing her back up to the cardiac unit. And she said, yes, I was nervous when they were putting me to sleep. And then she said, suddenly I was overwhelmed by this gratitude for having lived such a wonderful life. And I just felt this well of gratitude. And that's how I went to sleep. And I thought, yeah, that's where we all want to be at that moment. But there was a thing in what she said that, of course, I took completely differently than anybody else would had you been standing there, because having been together with her 52 years since I got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and we've got our 3 kids and 5 grandchildren, and all the water under the bridge, evangelical work, and the B movie business, and then as an author who, earned my living writing and so forth, I also know what a jerk I'd been to her at sometimes. And so in those words, especially covering the first 10 or 15 years of our marriage that were very rocky, very difficult, and she stuck with it. Of course, what I also heard was, I forgive you, because for her to look back over an entire course of a life at a moment like that and say that it's been wonderful means that it's been wonderful in spite of the fact that only I know how difficult it's been for her at some points, because I was the problem. So that those moments are truthful in a way of introspection, so in a way, maybe I won't say death's a good thing, but certainly knowing that it's not going to go on forever brings you some truth at some points, I think.
Did she return the question on the gurney? Were you scared?
Yes, we talked about that. And of course, that's the part of death I fear, because it isn't my going away I'm scared of. In a selfish way, I hope that I do not outlast those I love most. I've never had to experience the death of a child, although when my son was serving in Afghanistan as a Marine, getting shot at, I would have very quickly, if I had two buttons to push, the green and the red button, push the one where I was gone, because I don't want to survive a child or a grandchild, and nor do I particularly want to survive Jeannie. So in that sense, yes, I fear death. I fear loss, but not mine so much. I don't know how you feel about that.
The same. We have some similar conversations. I think everyone in my family agrees. I have 4 children. They all agree that my wife Kelly's the superstar, the goddess. So I'm most afraid of what would life without Kelly look like for any of us.
Yeah, me too. I mean, Jeannie's my Kelly. I understand you completely. Whatever else we talk about, believe me, I get that.
I mean, one of the things that struck me at an early age was when I was 20, I stepped on a landmine in Israel and lost my leg, and my right leg. And I use the analogy, now it's over 30 years ago, so it's not so integrated into my life. But what has always struck me were 2 things, back to the frequency of knowing that I can feel the foot I don't have even more than the one I do have. The one I do have, it's overused on my left side. I sort of take it for granted. And, that's the overused leg that overcompensates for having a missing leg. And someone said to me that 2 tricks. One is to make friends with your missing piece. And, the sooner you get to know your prosthetic leg and make friends with that, the better. And then over time, you realize that there are different types of phantom pain and phantom sensation. And this sort of, says something about death, I believe. When something is cut from you and it's a loved one, it's like a piece of you, a piece of your body that has been amputated from you. So you will have phantom pains, and those can show up as shooting pains, like in your foot, like a knife going up your foot, and you can't, it crashes in and you can think of nothing else. And those then become seasonal. But what you do have is phantom sensation with you. So I can always feel and strangely comforted by the foot that's missing. And that also made me think, the competitive advantage of being an amputee is therefore I can feel my energy shape, my frequency of a body and energy, even without my physicality. And so I can imagine what it would be like to leave the body and retain energy shape. So maybe I'm just making all that up, but
I love that.
I've
never heard anything. I've never heard anything like that. That's an original thought.
And so I love it.
I've never heard anything even close to that. I love that idea of feeling the energy shape of your body and that it sort of exists. That's just tremendous. I'm going to really think about that one. I will put it this way. I'll pay you the highest compliment. I'm going to tell Jeannie about that.
Loss is always, there is traumatic. And that's why I say aging is trauma in slow motion, because it's a series of loss of capabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's natural. This is not to be fought. It's not to be seen as unnatural in any way. I think our culture very often does make it like we're battling cancer. We're fighting against death. And I'm, what's the balance between that energy as well as surrendering and just accepting what is most natural? Yeah. And the death isn't a negotiation.
That's right.
It comes how it comes, and you go when you go. It seems to me rather factual, and so I feel like it's not my choice or for me, because some people want to make it their choice and believe they should maybe. You hear so often, and I think it's actually, as a person who's worked with disability for years, so much ableism in the death conversation. Well, when I get to that age, if I'm in diapers or a wheelchair, like shoot me or take me out back, or I know just a few pills later, I'm not going to go through that. And it's serially offensive to hear that conversation replayed hundreds of times. And you're like, really? You think people in wheelchair want to die? Or really you think mental illness or, losing function over your bladder is your worst thing? I'm not sounds like you've had a good life. Maybe spoiled a bit.
Yeah. And I think that's the ultimate argument against suicide for those of us who, like me, sometimes have suffered from depression. When you realize that what you mean to the people around you, especially in terms of just these little grandchildren right now, when you say you want to stick around to help them, you don't, let's say I was in the wheelchair. I had polio when I was 2 and my left leg is atrophied from the knee down. But so I sort of get, it's not a phantom limb, but there it is. But, let's say it had put me in an iron lung and that I would spend my life there, or something happened now and I fall off the ladder out there where I'm fixing up this deck and I break my neck. The idea that I'd remove myself from the equation when a conversation with me or even a smile or a hug would mean something to my little 7-year-old Nora is unthinkable. You're a part of her life. You're part of the stability and the rootedness in a life that's going to be so unrooted in so many ways that you can't predict. But hey, you're still there. So when people say, well, if I was disabled and I couldn't do anything, that's such nonsense, because the presence of one human being in another human's life is that. And you're still experiencing that with your mom, in that, yes, she has Alzheimer's, but she's here with you in some way still.
I think it goes both ways. It's not only great that you're in a wheelchair, alive, or whatever, that for other people's sake, but I don't know if it's a karma thing, but also for your own sake.
Yeah.
I feel that, because my wife says, women who are formidable in life are formidable in Alzheimer's. And that's what she's saying about my
I love that. We ought to put that one up on another good saying.
Mother Mimi, and so I think the 11 months I was taking care of her down in Florida, and then this longer drawn out time of Alzheimer's is actually for the 6 children to come to grips with the power this woman has held as a matriarch in the family, influencing through our lives. So on one hand, you can flip it and say, we need her to go slow to process as a family, actually, these relationships and intensities. And then she also is, for a grandma, was always FOMO, fear of missing out. She was out at the time on Kilimanjaro, she rode bikes, she was fit, she swam 6 days a week, got a couple degrees at Harvard. She was just insatiable for life. And so I think this, you're her weaning herself from all those attachments in a beautiful and big life. So I don't know. I still think it's a mystery. We project all sorts of things. I love this. My saying I love recently is the only exact science is projection.
Let me ask you a question about the sort of a double-barreled question here. You were in Israel doing something and you got your leg blown off. I want to know about that. And then I want to know how that led to this project of yours where you shared a Peace Prize. I'm guessing the two were somehow related. And I guess there's a third part there, and that was your State Department involvement in the Obama years. I don't know how those 3 things relate, but I think they probably are somehow related in terms of your interests and where your life has gone.
It isn't. People only in hindsight you connect the dots and create this story. I grew up, in an idyllic little bubble in Cohasset, Massachusetts. I go to Brown University. I'm exposed to different religions and races. Out of my white bubble, that sends me to be insatiable for diversity. I thought this is so exciting. It's why was I eating hamburgers and cheese all this time when you had all this beautiful menu to draw from in humanity? And then I became the first non-Jew to graduate with a degree in Judaic studies at Brown University. That led me to, when my advisor, Jacob Neusner, suggested that God doesn't speak Latin or Greek in heaven. I got, if I'm serious, I should just, go to Hebrew University in Jerusalem and learn Hebrew. So I packed up my bags. I was 19 years old. I went over and spent a year plus in Israel studying. Loved it, loved Jerusalem, loved walking in the footsteps of the prophets, and even, have the book of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible come alive to me, as well as the New Testament. So that was like all la la la. And then while walking in the footsteps of the prophets and camping with two of my best friends in northern Israel, we entered a minefield left over from the 1967 war.
Were you up on the sort of the Golan Heights kind of place, or then? Okay.
Al-Aziziyat is the name of the place, and most Israelis and also Syrians would know that as a heavily fought over tell or hillside.
Sure.
I just was looking for the best panoramic view to spend the night, when we finished camping with my two friends. So I just didn't know what a landmine was. I'm walking down the hill and packing up the next day, heading to Jerusalem. Boom, there's an explosion. What just happened? Is it a terrorist attack? Is it a rocket? Are we, no one had ever said the word landmines. I had never thought of them. It turns out this minefield had been laid by the Syrians in the 67 war with Soviet supplies mines, later on taken over by Israel and then never demined. And there were fences that were missing, and throughout the Golan, especially back in the day, this is 1984, where fences were not there and the minefields were not marked. So I found one, backing into it after a nice camp. So that was led to 6 months in the hospital in Israel, losing my leg. Thankfully, my two friends, Fritz and David, are healthy and back in the States. But that was an introduction at an early age to a near-death experience. Like, how do you deal with this? And then a world of disability and trauma and violence in the Middle East. So that changed me, I would say, not in the sense of, that's a before and after moment, right? April 12th, 1984, boom. That said, I didn't really talk about my landmine explosion, or after getting home to Boston and walking again. I tried skiing again, swimming again. Well, it was basically sort of performative, trying to show everyone that I was fine. Don't look at me, I have a fake leg. And it took me almost 2 years before I felt the sadness that came from that loss, because there was so much to do in rehab, learning to walk again with a fake leg, learning to ski again, play tennis again, to prove to everyone that I was okay. And that was actually one of when I talked to other amputees, I was like, how was the thing with your parents, staring at you? How was it with your siblings? And it's like a whole other comedic trauma of no one survives alone. So we all need each other, but how we help is a different question, I think. So anyway,
in that time frame, that this was not what I should have included this in my question. So you're working through all that. And then, of course, there's a Nobel thing and there's the State Department. Somewhere in there, you meet your wife, or did you know? I grew up with a polio leg, wearing a brace with kids staring at me and something to prove, I guess. At some point in my teenage years, it sort of changed, but you were conscious you had something when you're trying to meet girls. And it figured in, and I'm just throwing that in there as part of the narrative.
Because some people wouldn't marry or date a guy with a fake leg. I think, and I had an Israeli nurse telling me as much, why aren't you more angry? Don't you know what's happened to you? You seem, optimistic. And so for me, I never doubted, maybe it's a confident guy, I never doubted that I was attractive or that I would marry or have relationships I wanted or needed.
Yeah.
So it was almost a shock when others projected onto me how awful it was. And I was like, thanks for introducing that thought, but it wasn't one of mine. I was not in other countries around the world with a certain thing. You can see why they move very fast. I'll never get a job. I'll never be married. And I'll be a burden on my family, particularly in developing or less rich countries. But anyway, I went back to, graduated from Brown, moved to Washington, D.C., started to work on issues of nuclear arms and weapons of mass destruction. First at the Natural Resources Defense Council, but also doing some work at Brookings. So at that time, that's when I met. It was I met Kelly then, fell in love, said let's just, I'm a family guy. Let's just get this over with and churn out a family. People asked her, did she, know me before or after? Did it matter? Was this a charity marriage? And I'm so funny. And Kelly, so I'll tell you a story. When my kids used to bring me into class for show and tell when they were in elementary school, and they wanted the reveal, which was Dad, show them your leg. Show them.
Yeah.
They only know it as a cool thing, but for everyone else, it's a new thing. So especially one of my sons who's on the spectrum was like so eager for me to do the reveal. So finally, it's like, Bo, calm down. It's gonna come. So then you take up your pant leg. They see the robotic parts. That's cool or scary. Then you take it off. It's actually a notch more scary because you see the residual limb and something says something's off. Like this is a difference of ability, or we're all differently abled and differently looked. So then there's Q&A. They pass around the prosthesis, making sure this isn't traumatic, and you can ask any questions. So one boy raises his hand. Do you sleep with it on? I was like, oh, good question. Like, no, I take it off. Like, it's what the teacher in the back, the adults have the same questions, but would never ask.
Yes, exactly.
Does it hurt? Do you take a shower with it? Like just normal funny stuff. And then, he says, does your wife know?
Does your wife know? Yeah.
and then I said, yeah, of course. And he goes, and she still loves you?
Yeah, that's great.
Pretty young. And I said, yeah, and if she doesn't love me, it has very little to do with this bit.
Yeah.
So I think, so we got married there. So then 10 years after just living life, working in DC, making a family and all that, then I met Ken Rutherford, who is another American who had lost both his legs to a landmine in Somalia, also as a civilian. So you got to be clear that like there are 60 to 80 million landmines carried in up to 80 countries, and 80% of the victims of war and of landmines are civilians, not soldiers. I think the world, even when I tell soldiers that, they don't have the reference of the extent to which militaries affect civilian populations.
Yeah.
But it's a good reminder. So in my case, I was a statistic, and he said, with your job working on weapons of mass destruction, landmines are called weapons of mass destruction in slow motion.
Yeah.
Because they've killed more people than nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons combined. So why don't you get involved in this new movement where we're looking at the feasibility of a ban on landmines as like an indiscriminate, force that is excessively injurious to civilian populations according to international law. So he had lost both his legs, I had lost one. We joined forces and founded Landmine Survivors Network, which is one of the leaders in the international campaign to ban landmines. And so during that time, we also worked with the Princess of Wales and survivors all around the world to put a human face on the problem. That this wasn't like a military technology or security question. It was a humanitarian disaster and a human rights and environmental question. So that was the shift, and putting that human face on it and networking with 1,200 organizations around the world. It was that campaign that in 1997 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
I have a question about the prize. It's not anything to do with it. The closest I ever got to the Nobel ceremony is a very close friend of mine who I've written about in another context, Camilla Tilling, who's a lyric soprano and a wonderful singer, was the Nobel Prize. Not the Nobel, not the Peace Prize, but the rest of the Nobel ceremony. They have a concert with the royal family there and so forth, and she was the soloist. It was a lovely moment, and I texted her afterward, and we were talking about that. And of course, performing for that audience, and it's being televised around the world and so on, was a big thing for her, a good thing. But then I've always wondered, I have friends who have won Pulitzer Prizes, and I don't know anybody else who's won a Nobel. But I'm wondering, if that kind of defined things for you in a way that had some bad aspects to it as well, in the sense that I've talked to some writers who know people who have won Nobels for literature. It's sort of like winning an Oscar, different, but it then defines you, and either you spend the rest of your life trying to go, especially if it's an award for the arts, trying to come back to that point, or wishing you hadn't, because it's like you're not a Nobel Prize-winning guy, you are Jerry White, and you have a whole life and a family and all the rest of it. How did that all work out for you? Is it a good thing, a bad thing, an in-between thing?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think when you, so the good part, the easy, humbling part of leadership in the campaign was, this was 1,200 organizations in over 120 countries. Our lead coordinator, Jody Williams, the co-recipient you had. So this was a shared moment. And there were, of course, like, the top 10 leaders, or like we represented the survivors and worked with Princess Diana. So we were known for those contributions. And also for making sure that in the treaty to ban landmines included provisions for the rehabilitation and the social and economic reintegration of the victims. So the prize thing, I felt ambivalent. There we were all like, meeting the kings and queens and black ties and all that, and then champagne. And it seemed a little early, like the, Nobel tries to almost like get ahead of the curve of awarding something. And because we were a new model of becoming a civil society superpower and calling on the Pentagon and NATO and Russia, like calling militaries out to account, this was quite edgy and progressive in the 1990s and portended future campaigns. And then the use of celebrities working with Princess Diana authentically in minefields in Angola and Bosnia. Again, so there are a number of things were happening that were worthy of recognition, but it seemed so early, like we had just like been, or had the mine ban treaty negotiated. We hadn't started to destroy the stockpiles or also like get them out of the ground, let alone make sure, landmine victims could get legs and get jobs and get on with their lives. Like so there was this feeling of a haunting, like, yay, oof, like the work is all ahead of us. Like this is just a moment or a snapshot where like your stock price went up and then it can crash the next day when you just have to like face landmines blowing up every 20 minutes. So that's one thing. And then the other, over time, I learned about, I don't want to sound arrogant about this because I've been so blessed to have had opportunities to be recognized and be seen for leadership. So like I'm a Ashoka Fellow as well. There's a bunch of recognitions, I would say, over the last 30 years. They don't like thrill me. I find that they can be distractions. If it helps people fundraise, raise awareness for issues and all of that, I think they serve its purpose, but you have to know what it is and what it isn't. It doesn't make you any different. I'm the same Jerry before the landmine accident or before the award, and the same after. I'm a whole person, no matter whether I'm missing my legs. So I think you come to realize that at the time, and now like there's a danger. I think we're beyond heropreneurship. Like I think individual awards, whether for human rights, humanitarian, journalism, whatever, singles out. And we're in an age that requires shared leadership, like our campaign, and more humility from the bottom up. Like, so I don't think, I don't know, like when was the last like black tie gala event on like a serious topic that,
or when was the last time you get introduced as, Jerry White, quote, Nobel Peace Prize winner? That would seem to me to be difficult in a way, because then it's like, well, that's all in the past. That's not what you're doing right this second, is winning a prize.
I took off the landmine cape. It wasn't who I was, but for about 10 years of my life, I gave it my all. And then we also worked on people with disabilities around the world, cluster munitions, and then moved on to other issues. So I always thought like, it doesn't define me, although back to my quote about projection, people like projecting onto their friend, or I just met Jerry White, did you know he shares the Nobel Peace Prize, he knows Diana. I think it says more about them than me. They get a kick out of it. And I'm like, that's so last century. Like, where are we now? What's up?
What you were saying a moment ago about this kind of shared prize and the community effort that you made, a friend of mine who might have overlapped with you when you were at the State Department, Matthew Barzon, who was the UK ambassador from, first of all, to Sweden. So there's an overlap there. And then after that, Obama made him the ambassador to the UK. Matt was the, I guess, chief fundraiser for Obama, raised a lot of money for him for both campaigns, and came up with this, the idea of the small donors and everything. And he worked all that out and then got 2 ambassadorships as a reward. Did you overlap with Matt? And I interviewed him about.
I might have had a meeting with him in London.
Yeah, because he was going out and to high schools. He made big news worldwide because rather than doing the big ambassador thing, he started a program in the UK, and in the end, they visited hundreds of public schools and private schools where he would ask them what they thought about the United States and get ideas from them. And it became a very big deal. Then he wrote a book, which I interviewed him about a few months ago on this podcast, called The Power of Giving Away Power, where he talks about the Obama model of the power of giving away power, but then has taken it much further for himself, of saying that leadership is really not just delegating power to others, but stepping out of the way and so on. It's a wonderful little book, by the way, The Power of Giving Away Power. And Matthew and I talked about that, but it seems to overlap with the way you have seen your life in terms of using your moment in the sun, as a Nobel Prize winner and all these others to do other things, but also to kind of disperse that energy to others. I don't know whether if I've made it clear or not, because you perhaps haven't read his book, but I just think there's a real overlap there with Matthew's message in that book. What he did as an ambassador, which was not just white tie dinners and black this and that, but really reach out to the students across the UK and try to represent America to them, but also get their ideas about the States and bring that into the way he was configuring his work in the State Department. I don't know if you knew about any of that.
It's very similar. I was called in as a political appointee under President Obama to work at the State Department and create a new bureau called the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And the idea is, as you're saying, with our ambassador to the UK, was to get outside the embassy, outside the line.
Yes.
So we were sort of to be diplomats, almost like special force diplomats that actually engaged with religious actors, non-state actors, civil society, and actually spend almost no time in the embassies because we had become everywhere around the world. There's like barbed wire around U.S. embassies and so many security needs that you keep talking to the same 7 people again and again, unless. So the intention of the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations was just that, engaging of civil society in non-traditional diplomacy. So that's, I'm a non-traditional diplomat since I wasn't raised inside the system. This is the only time for 3 years I served the U.S. government.
And what was the job description when you were at State?
So Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to launch this bureau, including introducing data-driven analysis to conflict and gaming out predictive analytics as well as. And then the portfolio under Secretary Clinton was a strategy working group that engaged religious actors and diplomats in conflict mitigation together, like how to work together and not be afraid of engaging religious actors, which is critical since 84% of the world is actually affiliated with religion.
Yeah. Speaking of which, let me remind people they are watching, listening to, participating in Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am talking with Jerry White today, who is a diplomat, State Department guy, winner of a Nobel Peace Prize, sharer of a Nobel Peace Prize, stepped on a landmine in Israel, and has an amazing story to tell. Just to get back into the conversation, it seems to me that we've gone through so much political turmoil in the U.S. We were talking about the fear of death before. I have a fear of the future, not of death. So if you were saying, am I death phobic? I am future phobic. I don't see good things coming out of the international web. I don't like the fact my 13-year-old granddaughter, Lucy, has a cell phone. She uses it very judiciously because I'm her grandfather and her parents are her parents. But that whole thing worries me. I'm not phobic, I guess, but I think between environmental concerns, political concerns, having discovered that Trump was the president of the United States at 2:00 one morning, watching the clock on the New York Times slide away from Hillary, having done a fair amount of campaigning for political candidates around the country in the last midterms, and been pretty involved with things, having changed my opinion in terms of where I come from politically, from an evangelical right-wing background to where I'm at now, which I guess I'd describe as a sort of a progressive activist, I guess. And I wonder how you see things, because you've had a big life, and I would love to hear how you look toward the future and whether it's with a hope or despair, and if so, how. I don't have a position on this. I don't have a dog in this fight. This is not a rhetorical question. I'd really like to know what you think, because you've achieved some things with the landmine deal. You've seen things come and go. I'd love to know your perspective.
I love what you said, being future phobic, because I think one of the things we started at the State Department was this predictive analytics capability. And we outperformed our small little group of 6, outperformed like 16 intelligence agencies in like predictive analytics that are measured inside competitions inside the US government. They call it super forecasting. And so just using some game theory and regression analysis and marketing, different type of theories that have been well tested, we pulled together some techniques. And so it was interesting to be in the top 1% of like predictors, like saying this is what's going to happen next in Iraq or with Putin in Crimea. And then you could game these out and simulate data and preferences of the stakeholders and then test for accuracy. And then finding out, we were like 90%, 80 to 90% accurate in our predictions. So that what struck me is when I left government and we started a company to do just that, and maybe democratize predictive analytics. So everyone on your cell phone, you could say like, I don't know, are we bombing North Korea today, or what's the pros and cons?
Yeah.
And then you would game it out. So then I did have this similar thought, like, I don't think people want to know the future. I don't think they trust. They may like psychics or fortune tellers, but because they don't have to believe them and say it's kooky. But when the computer is doing the simulations and writes, and you have like the obvious coming towards you, I think it's time not to be future phobic, but to be present embracing of the future, if that makes sense. Like preparing and being in shape for the onslaughts that are upon us and coming. And luckily, resilience, as I've learned, is something you can get in shape for. So I think a lot of people are future phobic. The company that I formed went bankrupt, and I was like, I don't think they don't believe you can tell the future with high accuracy. We believe you could based on theories and math formulas and simulations. So that was interesting to me. And so I think for myself, I do see increased violence coming, not only around the world. I mean, interstate violence is down, so that's good. There's a lot of good happening, and I think the news doesn't paint the picture, the wholesome picture. So the wholesome trends for many in the world are positive, and violence is going down. However, religion-related or religiously motivated violence is the fastest kind of violence that's showing up around the world, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia, but now everywhere.
Well, you have a book that you've been working on about that. Is it out?
In June, so we'll have to talk again maybe next year.
Oh, well, we will. I hope we talk many times because I'm so interested in what you're saying, and I love the things you're talking about. But just talk about that book for a minute, because obviously you're
Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence.
Have you finished working on it?
Yeah, the manuscript is in. The published date is next June, and I was afraid it would be a bad book and not have impact, which I think is the same thing. I now feel that it's, I'm a co-author, Georgette Bennett, that this may be an important book, tracking the trends of religicides happening on our watch against the Yazidis, against the Uyghurs in China, the Tibetans, the Rohingya. Like we used to ask, or maybe when I was younger, I wonder what I would be like in the Holocaust or if I lived in Europe or Germany. I wanted to be a helper, a righteous Gentile or a protector, but it's not really what we see around the world. We see a lot of silence in the face of mass violence. Tens of millions of people being stalked. It's accelerated by high-tech surveillance as well. So if you're asking what would you do in the face of genocides, like, look, you're doing it, what we do each day. And it's not to blame, it's just to be reality-based. But then the question of the book, the invitation is, like, where is the hope here? How can we, work against this? And so I think that religicide's hallmarks are genocide, massacres against the people, trying to get rid of them. Ecocide, destruction of their very land, sacred lands, cemeteries, heritage, etc. And then factocide. And factocide is disinformation and big lies left and right. Like the Yazidis are devil worshippers. That's a false narrative, but has sunk in to justify killing in the name of ISIS or God. So these are serious issues. In our own domestic situation, I also think that when you see too huge division in a country or in a society or civilization that's massive, like let's say we just call it simplicity, like Republicans and Democrats, or a country divided and polarized, then you will see, according to the analysis of theories and data, a rise in anti-Semitism, a rise in scapegoating, a rise in Islamophobia. And we've been seeing this, a rise against the other, the person different, because the two big ones, if they go to war, it's massively devastating to the whole country. So during this time of competition, you will see a growth in scapegoating and making the other person evil. And when it comes to political and electoral violence, yeah, I think that we're seeing the violence go up. We should be anticipating it and therefore creating antibodies to disrupt it locally as it spreads.
Yeah, it seems to me, having been part of a very fervent religious movement in the 70s and 80s, and basically credited or discredited, the BBC did a program on me a couple of weeks ago called 1,000 Dolls, which was taken from an image in the movie I directed called Whatever Happened to the Human Race with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, and then my father, Francis Schaeffer, and really the beginning of the Protestant involvement in the anti-abortion movement. And having seen that trajectory, something that I often think about is that, when I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, the scuttlebutt was we're moving into a secular time. The future is going to, especially from our victim point of view of fundamentalist missionaries living in Europe, the big bad secular world. In other words, the trajectory starting in the Renaissance, going through the Enlightenment, is now going to eat our lunch. We are the minority and we're going to be persecuted as evangelical Christians because the big bad secular world run by Harvard and Yale and the New York Times and whomever is totally in the other direction. Science is not our friend. It's odd now, pushing 70 in the 21st century, to be at a period of history where I tried to explain when I'm on the media to folks that the experience of the white evangelicals having taken over the Republican Party with a big push from my family back in the 70s and 80s. My friends were Jack Kemp, and we knew the Bushes and the Reagans, and Gerald Ford's son lived in my house for a year. My parents would stay in the White House, et cetera. Full circle now, we're in an age of wars of religion globally, and that, whether it's Hindu nationalism, whether it's Wahhabist Islam spread by the Saudis, and the kind of radicalization of that religion through them in some ways, evangelical white fundamentalist Christianity in America now becoming a kind of Christian nationalism. It's always been that, but more so. What's going on in Hungary, Poland, you name it. We're moving into an age of religion that is far, that doesn't seem to be part of the future that I anticipated as a teen and a 20-something. Do you have any comment on that? Because I think that fits in with what you're saying in some way.
And I think, the idea of we're increasingly, correction number one if you're a persecuted minority or perceive yourself as such, as white Christian evangelicals,
right,
or fundamentalists, it also plays into what your scripture is calling you to be. You're a sign of a better Christian if you're persecuted and standing in the face of violence and truth, or martyred. So the culture rewards a perception that is untrue because it's an insider conversation with the culture, finding demons and others around. The fact is the world is religifying. As I mentioned earlier, over 84% of the world is affiliated, and they having higher birth rates and more populations around the world. So the West has experienced, maybe as your parents feared, more secularization in the sense of empty churches, in Europe and the United States. So this fear and this perception of victimhood and persecution coalesces a group, a tribe, whether religion or cult, whatever, to become even more solidified and then act out in maybe ways of they would see self-defense. Also watching when religions do cozy up with power, which you see around the world, it doesn't really end well, for them. But it might be if evangelicals or Christian nationalists are cozying up to, or as your parents did, back in the Reagan days, this type of wedding and this love of power that I see in Christians. Mm-hmm. When was the last time you read the Beatitudes or Sermon on the Mount? I don't know. I don't recognize this angry, hating, power. I don't understand. This doesn't speak Jesus to me, and it seems to sort of obvious to everyone else watching. But the bubble still feels persecuted, and then this is their moment at all costs over a single issue like abortion. These are complex dynamics, complex issues, and I hope I don't come across as too glib or even judging those dynamics. Mm-hmm. They just are. That's how groups behave. And this is how, when a conflict becomes religified, how it behaves. So we don't have to personalize everything and go on the attack. I don't find it helpful to be disdainful at all to any religious minority or even, in my backyard. I feel like
here in the here in the States, it's taken an odd turn because with people like Amy Coney Barrett, who were very influenced by the kind of evangelicalism, even though she was Roman Catholic, she was part of this evangelical informed group as well. You know, my father was involved in talking to some of the people who founded the Federalist Society, saying, you know, don't be a preacher, don't be a missionary, go into the law so we can eventually take over the courts. And of course, that agenda now manifests itself in things, for instance, when a church wants to meet in the era of COVID, and they're given an exemption by the court in the name of religious liberty, and or the right to fire a gay person from your faculty in the name of religious liberty. So we're now seeing, in a sense, the wish list of the 70s and 80s being fulfilled at the highest levels in the US, something that happened. You know, do you have a response to that? Or,
you see, I mean, how you, like, whether raising kids or politics and campaigning, start how you want to finish. And if you're seeding that manifestation and you're making like a culture war or some, you know, abortion or sexuality or other things, your top items, and the culture, the Christianity has narrowed it to be like, these are the buzz, and people were programmed to think this wasn't like an accident. This happened over time from Nixon to Reagan, whatever. And it's most unfortunate, like it breaks my heart. I want to also make clear, like even in Islam around the world and, you know, Christianity, the vast majority are not violent.
Right.
The vast majority. So we hang on to that. It's like not many of us want to, like, so if you think I'm going to hell, and you're worried about my soul or trying to convert me, I'm not, but it's okay. You may hate my religion, but in fact, there's a line of like, then where incitement to violence takes place. I don't really care if you hate me or believe I'm deceived and think I'm going to hell, but there's no machetes involved. There's no like guns. There's a point even with our religion and what we have in common for compassion and peace building to build on that. But in fact, on the difference front, I like celebrating difference and then protecting that line. Like it gives you no right to physically harm, back to like genocide, ecocide, and factocide, to spread lies about me, incite violence against me, and destroy my community and heritage and discount me. Like it's sort of obvious according to our law, but we must remind the country. The bigger trends are positive. Most people are resilient, and very few are the type who really take up arms and attack. And that type of, let's call it looking at violence as a epidemic, that type of disease that takes place in a community and tries to spread, there are also ways to interrupt violence like a disease. So if even you demoralize the conversation into a public health approach, how do we build resilient communities in America who can interrupt violence and stop retaliations? Cure Violence by my friend Gary Slutkin does just that. I think they should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So it's innovative and a brilliant approach to dealing with violence and taking it out of all of this interpersonal morality-based play.
We're going to put any link you would like to have, or links or names of books or places people can find what you're doing will be appearing wherever this podcast goes out. And Ernie, my producer, will stay on with you a little bit after we finish and make sure we are linking to everything, including your future book, by the way. When will it show up on Amazon for pre-sale? It's a little early for June, but
no, it's already up there, and they're exexcited. It would come out.
Well, go buy some copies. I'm going to get one immediately and tell people about it, and we'll do more when it's out. On the book itself, we'll do a whole interview just on the book. So do tell Ernie where people can get in touch with you. I would just say, you know, in reaction to what you were saying a moment ago, I am not a pessimist about the future. I fear elements of the future. And the reason I'm not a pessimist is sort of for a different reason than the one we've been talking about. And that is that in writing about relationships and what taking care of children has meant to me, and a set of priorities that is focused less on career and more on relationships. You know, our definition of success is so career oriented. It's your job title, it's the amount you earn. And I think actually the real definition of success is interpersonal relationships and whether you're successful at those. And that has nothing to do with career or the college you went to. So that's kind of been my thing for the last 5 or 6 years, working on a new book of mine about that. But in doing that study, because I have some very sciencey friends who pointed me in the right direction, something that really leapt out is that what was more popular 30, 40 years ago with books like The Selfish Gene was this idea of a kind of a rapacious people, and empathy and these sorts of things were just cherry on the dessert. It was superficial because really we're very grasping, competitive. The new phrase that I use in my book that other people are also using, I didn't invent this, but science people did, is the survival of the friendliest, and that it's really about cooperation. And you and me, Jerry, are only sitting here talking today because someone in our ancestral history took care of somebody when they didn't have to. There was a child left by a path. A wild animal had killed its mother, and somebody walked by and picked that child up, and they didn't enslave it, and they didn't kill it, and they didn't eat it. They took it home and they raised it. That's why you're sitting here today. That's why I'm sitting here. That kind of story plays out. I think the human race is a caregiving race. Love is a thing. It's as real as a heart attack. It can be studied. And in fact, in the book that I've just published, I have whole chapters and backup on this. Caregiving is the primary call of all human beings. It's what we respond to most. One of the reasons we have so much loneliness and sorrow in our society is by giving us a career model for success rather than a caregiving model. We have made people very sad, not because Jesus says so or there's a better philosophy, but evolution conditioned us to actually find our greatest meaning in relationships and caregiving, the receiving and giving of care. That said, I'm not a pessimist about the future, because just like you're saying, most people are not, and then fill in the blank, violent and so forth. Most people actually tend to want to be caregivers or receive care. They look for that community. But it seems to me that modern America, with the bottom line being profits for shareholders, often goes in the direction of saying, the first thing you ask someone is, well, what do you do? And that's kind of our way of saying, who are you? But it's unrelated to what really matters. And I loved our conversation.
Like in Washington, where we've lived for a long time, that's the number one question. So what do you do? And she likes, and I use the same phrase with, more often, like, how do you like to spend your day? It's just like a classier way of engaging someone on what they may want to talk about. But I agree with you on this point of, on the point of resilience. I think like our dopamine, serotonin levels go up. You're absolutely right with the survival of the friendliest. So there's what they say: food, sex, sleep, and giving are the four wirings in our system that will get our mood up. So like, have you had a good meal? Go enjoy some sex, however, and are you also, sleeping well? And have you given today? Like, where is your giving? So that community piece. And then the next point is that religion has been the source of that sort of group altruism of survival and evolution over the time, that people survive in groups, and they survive where they're having like, some social, they're not bowling alone anymore. They're with people. That's a concern of the future for me. And the present is in the fragmentation of society in the modern era, in the speed at which it's happened, and how alone people are with the mental health crisis and suicide rates going up, that lack of resilience, which is a social function, community, we survive in communities. We need not only the giving and the humor and the love. That's where are we getting it? Is it a rock concert? Is it your alma mater? Is it like, a political rally? No, traditionally, that's why religion continues to be one of the main sources of resilience all around the world today. And where Europe and the West and the United States are most at risk without the gummy and sticky factor to keep us together.
Yeah, and it seems to me the reason the better aspects of religion make sense, we talked about the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, is because in a way, evolution that obviously predates religion by hundreds of thousands of years, because religion is very young. It's like an eye blink, like writing is, or anything else that we do. We were conditioned to hear things like, do unto your neighbor as you would have done to you. Okay, so Jesus said similar things, but the only reason they made sense and resonated and suddenly became organized movements is because the human race knew enough about its own survival needs to codify these things with laws, religions, and moral teachings. But the evolutionary imperative came first. Otherwise, none of this would have caught on, is my point of view. I don't know what you think about that.
I would say I agree to a certain extent, and also would add that you look how religions aren't just a blip when you think of like surviving over millennia. Or I look at indigenous traditions and the Yazidis. When I look at like the deep resources that they have going back, centuries at least.
Yes.
And then you see these great civilizations, including the United States or Rome or the Netherlands, or like where there are peaks. And those are the things that are very ephemeral and transitory. Like they don't last. What has had the marathon of resilience and longevity in the human race is the importance of narrative storytelling and belief to stick us together. So it's hard to predict exactly where we'll end up on this, because it's not getting prettier. But the good news is resilience can be built socially and in groups, and we need to reinvent how we do that in America. And I think in this case, it's going to be through, cooperation circles or interfaith approaches, including atheism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But in fact, in community, finding place where one does common tasks and builds relationally, because we have to get that sinew and those synapses back together in a country that is bowling alone too often and people are in their phones. So I'm not criticizing bowling or cell phones.
Yes.
I'm saying what we're missing for survival and the antibodies for violence is this type of resilience building at a community.
And do you get into some of that in the new book?
Yeah, you slog through these cases and you're almost ready to despair. So you hit the history of like human rights, on why the UN is failing on some of these issues, what is violence and how do we get to mass violence. And so even writing the book this summer, I was like, I'm so depressed because I was on the chapter of the Uyghurs or the Rohingya, and I was like, this is really tough stuff. And you could say China is one of the lead perpetrators of religicide in the world today, and how they're doing it is also reading from the playbook of what we did in the United States against our Native American groups and indigenous around the country, like point. We had the playbook on like white colonial settler land seas and destruction of culture along the way. So we're just seeing this happen in different cultures. And again, I'm not throwing stones at glass houses. I'm just saying there. By the time you get to the book, my co-author and I try to build. This is what can be done at a top-down level, a middle-out level, and a bottom-out level, including engagement of governments and civil society and individual believers and survivors where they live. And where they live is where violence is happening, right? Violence isn't theoretical. It's like politics. It's all local. Systemic violence as well.
I would ask people watching this to note that Religicide will be out in June. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that will come quickly. Pre-order a copy so that you can support the book. It means a lot to an author to see those pre-order numbers go up, as I well know. This is Frank Schaeffer, and you have been listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Today, my guest has been Jerry White, who has shared a Nobel Peace Prize and is the author of this new book, Religicide, that is coming out. And my book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, is out. Please buy it and support that book as well. There's a huge overlap in that book with what I have been talking with Jerry about. I have deliberately not brought the title up until this moment because this is his program and we are promoting Religicide. But if you have the budget for 2 books, buy mine too. Thank you. And this has been a real pleasure, Jerry. Thank you to Jose Zylstra, my friend, for introducing you to me or me to you. So Jose, when you watch this is all you again. In the old days, we used to talk about a Rolodex, but you have the most interesting Rolodex in the country. I keep meeting people through you. Basically, it's just, well, Jose just sent another great gift to me, like a fairy godmother. And his name's Jerry White. So thank you so much, Jerry. And I do really want to do some more conversations with you as you have time, and we will get thoroughly behind your book. I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Thank you, Frank and Jose, for making the connection. I think it's an important time to connect. So,
thank you so much.
Great holidays, happy Thanksgiving, and we'll keep in touch.
And all the best to Kelly as well.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.